I moved into Willowbrook Estates on a Tuesday in April, grateful to finally have a place where I could work remotely in peace. The neighborhood was picture perfect, with manicured lawns and matching mailboxes lining streets named after trees that didn't actually grow in our climate. I'd done my due diligence before buying, reading through the HOA documents with the same attention I'd applied during my years as a corporate attorney. Everything seemed reasonable enough. Standard stuff about lawn maintenance, exterior paint colors requiring approval, nothing I couldn't live with. I should have paid more attention to the name at the bottom of those documents. Karen Hofstetter, HOA President. My first encounter with Karen came exactly 9 days after I moved in. I was unloading groceries when a woman in pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the Willowbrook Estates logo marched up my driveway, clipboard in hand. "Good afternoon. I'm Karen Hofstetter, HOA President. I need to discuss several violations. Before I could even set down my bags, I hope you enjoyed the beginning of this story. If you're loving the drama and want to hear more stories about entitled people getting what they deserve, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, back to the story." I blinked at her. "Violations? I just moved in last week." "Exactly," she said, making a check mark on her clipboard. "Which means you've had plenty of time to familiarize yourself with our community standards. First, your garbage bins are visible from the street. They must be stored behind your fence or in your garage at all times except on collection days. Second, you have a package on your front porch that's been there for 2 days. All deliveries must be brought inside within 24 hours. Third, your lawn was cut to 2.7 inches. Our standard is 3 inches exactly." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline that never came. She was completely serious, her thin lips pressed together in what I would come to recognize as her signature expression of petty authority. "I'll give you until tomorrow to rectify these issues. After that, it's a $50 fine per violation per day." That first encounter set the tone for everything that followed. I complied with her demands because I'm not one for unnecessary conflict, and honestly, I had bigger things to worry about. My consulting work kept me busy, and I was in the middle of closing a deal that would add a significant chunk to my already comfortable portfolio. But Karen, as I quickly learned, was the type of person who interpreted compliance as weakness and silence as an invitation to escalate. The next week, she cited me for having my porch light off at 9:30 at night. Apparently, there was a rule that all homes must have exterior lighting until 10 p.m. for safety reasons. The week after that, my car was parked 3 inches over the edge of my driveway onto my own lawn, which was apparently creating an eyesore. Then it was the color of my welcome mat, maroon instead of the approved earth tones. Then my garden hose was visible from the street. Then I'd planted petunias in my front bed without prior approval. Never mind that 6 other houses on the block had the exact same flowers. Each violation came with Karen personally delivering the notice, clipboard in hand, a gleam of satisfaction in her eyes as she recited the specific bylaw I'd violated. I started keeping the notices in a folder, partly for my own records and partly because some lawyer instinct told me I might need documentation later. By month 3, I had 17 violation notices, totaling over $800 in fines. I tried the reasonable approach first. I attended an HOA meeting and calmly pointed out that I was being disproportionately targeted compared to other residents. Karen smiled sweetly and said, "The rules apply to everyone equally. If you feel you're receiving more notices, perhaps it's because you're violating more rules." 3 board members sat beside her, nodding along like bobbleheads, clearly too intimidated or apathetic to challenge her. I paid the fines and adjusted my behavior, becoming hypervigilant about every tiny rule. But Karen was creative. When she couldn't find legitimate violations, she started inventing interpretations. My doorbell camera was apparently a surveillance device that required approval. The bird feeder in my backyard was attracting wildlife in violation of pest control standards. The solar pathway lights I installed were the wrong shade of white, creating light pollution. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in July. I was hosting a small lunch for a few colleagues, nothing elaborate, just 4 people on my back patio. We were discussing a potential merger I was consulting on, one that would involve significant international contracts. These were serious people, executives and attorneys from firms that billed by the minute. Karen let herself through my side gate, which I had foolishly left unlocked, and marched into my backyard. "Excuse me," she announced loudly, interrupting a colleague mid-sentence. "You're in violation of the guest parking policy. You have 3 vehicles parked on the street within view of your residence. The limit is 2. One of these vehicles needs to be moved immediately, or I'll have it towed." My colleague stared at her in bewilderment. I felt heat rising in my face, not from anger, but from sheer embarrassment. "Karen, these are my guests. They'll be leaving in a few hours. This is completely unreasonable." "The rules don't pause for your convenience," she replied, actually writing out a violation notice right there in my backyard. "You have 15 minutes to move a vehicle, or I'm calling the towing company." She handed me the notice and walked back out through my gate. One of my colleagues, a senior partner at a firm that handled international real estate acquisitions, raised an eyebrow. "That's your HOA president? That's quite a situation you've got there." The lunch was effectively ruined. We wrapped up quickly, and after everyone left, I sat in my backyard staring at the violation notice. I'd spent my career solving complex problems for people who paid premium rates for creative solutions. I'd structured deals across 6 continents, navigated regulatory frameworks in countries where the rules changed daily, and once helped a client acquire an entire city block through a series of shell companies that left their competition wondering what happened. But here I was, being nickel and dimed by a suburban dictator with a clipboard and too much time on her hands. That evening, I opened my laptop and started doing what I do best, research. I read through every single HOA document, every amendment, every meeting minute from the past 10 years. I pulled property records for the entire neighborhood. I researched Karen herself, her employment history, her social media, her public records. I made calls to a few contacts, people who owed me favors from past deals, and started asking very specific questions. What I discovered was interesting. Willowbrook Estates had been built by a developer who'd gone bankrupt shortly after the last homes were completed. In the rush to exit, they'd transferred ownership of all common areas, including the small community park, the retention pond, and the walking trails, to the HOA. But there was one piece of property they'd sold separately, a landlocked parcel right in the center of the neighborhood that was technically outside HOA jurisdiction. It was undeveloped scrubland, about half an acre, surrounded on all sides by HOA property. Access to it required crossing HOA common areas, which the original buyer had secured through an easement agreement. That buyer had been an investment company that promptly forgot about the property for 15 years. It didn't generate income, couldn't be easily developed due to the access issues, and was basically worthless. They'd been paying minimal property taxes on it, probably written off as a bad investment and forgotten in someone's filing cabinet. I made a phone call on Monday morning. By Wednesday, I owned that parcel for less than the cost of a used car. The investment company was thrilled to unload it. Now came the interesting part. I reviewed the easement agreement carefully. It granted access across HOA property to reach the parcel, but was remarkably vague about what that access entailed. It had been written quickly, probably by the developer's attorney, who was juggling a dozen crisis fires during the bankruptcy. The language said access for any lawful purpose, with no restrictions on frequency, method, or scope. I made another call, this one to a civil engineering firm I'd worked with on a commercial development deal in Colorado. I need a site assessment and development plan. Fast. I sent them the property specs and the easement agreement. They got back to me in 4 days with exactly what I needed. The parcel, while landlocked, was properly zoned for residential development. With creative engineering, it could support a structure. It would require bringing in utilities through the easement, which was explicitly permitted under the agreement's language. The engineering firm drew up plans for a small residential building, technically a garage with a studio apartment above it, fully compliant with county codes. Here's where Karen's own rules became deliciously relevant. The HOA had extremely strict regulations about construction, renovations, and even repainting existing structures within its jurisdiction. Every single change required Architectural Review Board approval, a process that Karen controlled with an iron fist. She denied people's requests to change their shutters to a slightly different shade of the approved color. She'd made one resident go through 3 rounds of revisions to approve a mailbox replacement. But my parcel wasn't in HOA jurisdiction. It was exempt from all those rules. And the easement gave me legal right of access to reach it. I submitted my building permits to the county, not the HOA. I hired contractors and scheduled the work to begin in September. I had materials delivered and stockpiled on my new property, accessing it by driving across the HOA's walking trail, which was the most direct route and clearly covered under the easement's access provisions. The first time a delivery truck rumbled across the trail, I was watching from my home office window. I saw Karen come running out of her house, like she'd heard a gunshot. She physically stood in front of the truck, clipboard raised like a shield. I walked over to observe. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked. "You cannot drive trucks through our common areas. This is absolutely forbidden." I handed her a copy of the easement agreement, highlighted for her convenience. "I own the parcel that trail leads to. This easement grants me access. I'm exercising my legal right." She read the document, her face cycling through shades of red and purple that would have been concerning if I cared about her blood pressure. "This is residential property. You can't just drive construction vehicles through here. The easement says access for any lawful purpose. Construction is lawful. If you prevent me from exercising my easement rights, you'll be in breach of a recorded legal agreement, and I'll file suit against the HOA. I'd suggest you move." She moved. But she didn't go quietly. Over the next week, she called the county building department 4 times trying to stop my permits. She called the police twice claiming I was trespassing. She sent certified letters threatening legal action. She held an emergency HOA meeting where she ranted about my violation of community spirit and tried to get the board to authorize spending HOA funds to sue me. None of it worked. My permits were valid. My easement was recorded and legally binding. The police told her it was a civil matter. And when the HOA's attorney actually reviewed the situation, he advised them in writing that they would absolutely lose any lawsuit and would likely be liable for my attorney fees under the easement agreement's prevailing party clause. Construction began in October. I made sure my contractors started work at exactly 7 a.m. every day, which was the earliest allowed under county noise ordinances. The access route across the walking trail meant trucks passed within 30 feet of Karen's house. I had concrete trucks, lumber deliveries, equipment haulers, all rumbling past her window 6 days a week. I watched her try everything. She put up unauthorized barriers on the trail, which I had removed and billed the HOA for my attorney's time spent demanding it. She tried to organize the neighbors against me, but most of them were too scared of becoming her next target to join her crusade. A few even stopped me to quietly say they hoped I knew what I was doing. The structure went up faster than typical residential construction because I'd paid premium rates for an expedited timeline. By December, I had a beautiful building standing on that landlocked parcel, a 2-story structure with a 4-car garage below and a 1,000 square foot studio apartment above, all finished in exterior materials that Karen would have never approved if she'd had any say, bright red metal siding visible from her front windows. But I wasn't done. The easement allowed access for any lawful purpose. I registered the studio apartment as a short-term rental property with the county. Perfectly legal. Not subject to any HOA restrictions because the property wasn't in HOA jurisdiction. And then I listed it on every vacation rental platform at extremely competitive rates. The first guests arrived in January, a family with 3 small children who were delighted to have a place with a full kitchen during their week-long stay. They accessed the property by driving across the HOA trail, just like I'd been doing. Karen tried to stop them at the entrance. They called me, confused. I called my attorney, who called Karen and explained that interfering with my guests' lawful use of the easement would result in immediate legal action. The short-term rental was a roaring success. I priced it right and maintained it well. I averaged 3 to 4 bookings per week. Each booking meant vehicles driving across that trail, guests coming and going at all hours within the bounds of the law, strangers in the heart of Karen's carefully controlled kingdom that she had absolutely no authority over. I made sure every single guest knew their rights under the easement. I provided them documentation. I told them if anyone harassed them, to call me immediately. Some guests were quiet professionals in town for business. Others were families with energetic kids. I had a bachelorette party group once, a group of women who stayed up late laughing on the apartment's balcony, which overlooked the neighborhood and had a perfect view of Karen's house. Karen tried to get the county to revoke my rental license. She filed complaints about noise, parking, disturbances. The county investigated every single complaint and found them all to be either exaggerated or outright false. After the 4th baseless complaint, the county inspector told me off the record that they were starting to consider harassment charges against the complainant. She tried to rally the HOA to purchase my parcel, to end this nightmare by buying me out. I declined the offers, which started reasonable and escalated to frankly absurd amounts. I didn't need the money. What I needed was for Karen to understand that her petty tyranny had consequences. The breaking point came in March, almost a year after that disastrous lunch in my backyard. The HOA's insurance company notified them that their premiums were increasing by 40% due to the excessive legal consultations and potential liability exposure from Karen's ongoing harassment campaign against me and my rental guests. Several homeowners, facing increased HOA dues to cover the premium increase, started openly questioning Karen's leadership. An emergency board meeting was called. I didn't attend. HOA meetings were only open to properties within their jurisdiction, but I heard about it from 3 different neighbors who'd finally found their courage. Karen tried to rally support for one last legal push against me, insisting that my rental operation was destroying property values and community character. One of the board members, a retired engineer who'd quietly endured Karen's rules for years, finally spoke up. He pointed out that every legal opinion they'd received said I was completely within my rights. He noted that the HOA had spent over $30,000 in legal fees fighting a battle they couldn't win. He suggested that maybe the problem wasn't me, but rather an HOA president who'd let personal vendetta override common sense and fiduciary responsibility. The vote of no confidence was called right there. Karen lost her position as HOA president by a vote of 4-0, with her own second abstaining. The board appointed an interim president and formally voted to cease all legal action against me and my property. I learned about the vote the next morning. That afternoon, I was working in my home office when I saw Karen walking up my driveway. No clipboard this time. She looked smaller somehow, deflated. I met her at the door. "You did this on purpose," she said. "Not a question, a statement. This whole thing, the property, the rental, all of it. You engineered this to get back at me." I looked at her calmly. "You made my life miserable over garbage cans and doorbell cameras and parking by the inch. You embarrassed me in front of professional colleagues. You issued 17 violations in 3 months for things that harmed no one. You built your entire identity around controlling other people's lives over petty nonsense. I simply exercised my legal property rights. Everything I did was completely within the law. I just did it in a way that you couldn't control, and that drove you absolutely crazy." "But the rental?" she said weakly. "The constant traffic, the strangers, you're destroying our neighborhood. I'm running a legal business on property I legally own, accessed via a legal easement. Every guest follows the law. Any noise complaints have been investigated and found baseless. The only thing I'm destroying is your ability to dictate every aspect of everyone's existence. You could have left me alone. You could have applied the rules reasonably. Instead, you chose to escalate at every opportunity. This," I gestured toward my rental property, clearly visible behind her, "is what happens when someone with resources decides they've had enough of a petty tyrant." She stood there, processing the full scope of what I'd done. I owned property she couldn't regulate, generating rental income and activities she couldn't control, access through an easement she couldn't revoke, all perfectly legal and utterly beyond her authority. Her own vendetta had cost her the position she clung to, had cost the HOA thousands in legal fees, and had turned the neighbors against her. The rules and systems she'd weaponized against others had been used to build something that would outlast her reign and serve as a permanent reminder of what happens when petty power goes unchecked. I watched the realization wash over her face, the understanding that she'd been completely, thoroughly, and permanently outmaneuvered using nothing but property law, creative thinking, and her own inability to let minor issues go. If you enjoyed this story of epic legal revenge, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to Karen Eat World for more tales of entitled people meeting their match. Drop a comment below telling me about your own HOA horror stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next one.